Well, as I record this, it's December 7th, 2025, exactly 10 years to the day from the moment when Donald Trump called for, quote, a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on, unquote. Since that time and over the last 10 years, Donald Trump has repeatedly attacked, scapegoated, and expressed prejudicial fear, anger, opposition, and hatred toward Muslims around the world. And I've seen this corrosive Islamophobia go mainstream as well and impact the evangelical Christian church and Christians generally, society, and also Christian apologists. And I've seen people like Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity, who used to be a very welcoming, ecumenical, generous figure, become more and more focused upon attacking Islam, and often I find in the most uncharitable, combative ways possible. People like Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy, David Wood, are I think even more acerbic and combative in their styles. And it should stand to reason, yeah, you can identify Muslims who are extreme and who express intolerant views. You can, of course, identify Muslims who are terrorists, but judging an entire group of 2 billion people by a select few individuals, bad apples, quote unquote, is a pretty terrible way to reason. That brings me to this book that I just finished reading, Bridges of Love and Understanding: How to Bring the Message of Jesus to Muslims and Everyone Else Too, by Rebecca Davis. It's a simple book, and yet it is, I think, a profound and important book. It's born of Davis's experience of 20 years living in Muslim countries and ministering to Muslim neighbors. It's very practical in its orientation. Now, interestingly, I would acknowledge that Davis doesn't disclose the countries she's lived in or the country she currently lives in. And that, of course, is going to mean some of the Christian apologists out there who are very antagonistic toward Islam are going to say, see, that is the problem with Islam right there in a nutshell. It is an intrinsically, inherently intolerant religious perspective, because look at this intolerance that a Christian author living in a Muslim country can't even disclose where they live. Well, that's, I think, a problem, a misunderstanding of one's analysis. The truth is that this is the fact that Islam right now appears more intolerant and Christianity appears more tolerant to many people is a reality of a historical accident. For example, let's say that you were born and lived in Reformation era Europe. At that time, if you were a Muslim or a Jew living in Europe, you would face widespread persecution, forced conversion, and expulsion from Christian Europe. In other words, if you lived in Europe at that time, you would look at the expression of Christianity as being very intolerant of Islam and Judaism. By contrast, the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Ottoman Empire at the time, was comparatively tolerant of Christians and Jews. What has happened is Christianity in Europe and in the West underwent a long, painful process of enlightenment. Some of the steps involved the Peace of Augsburg and the Peace of Westphalia, in particular in 1648, and the Enlightenment vision that was cultivated by people like deistic Christian John Locke, Pierre Bayle, and also Voltaire. So today, when we enjoy a Christianity, quote unquote, that seems tolerant and inclusive and welcoming comparatively, that is a historical accident of Christianity having undergone a historical evolution and process. And there's nothing intrinsic to Islam that means it cannot undergo a similar process. In fact, all the Muslims I know personally, and I know many Muslims, and I work with Muslims in my job, all the Muslims I know are wonderful people. They make beautiful, perfect neighbors, work colleagues. They're very inclusive and tolerant. Frankly, even more so, I would say, certainly say, than many of the evangelical Christians I know. So be very careful about the hasty generalization about different groups. and be very careful about saying Islam is inherently intolerant and oppressive, but Christianity is very welcoming and tolerant. What Davis says in her book is page 7, if your only experience with Muslims is what you see on the news, it is very likely your impression will be negative. What if your only experience with Christians was what you heard on the news? That's a simple point, but it's a critically important point. I'm amazed how many Christians will form their opinions about 2 billion Muslims on the planet based upon their very limited data set and their prejudicial, confirmatory, biased processing of that limited data set. And so then they end up saying, and I saw this from a very popular Christian Twitter account just in the last 2 days. This person says, Muslim and terrorist are the same thing, and you will never convince me otherwise. So this person, and this tweet had over 50,000 likes. And this person is saying all 2 billion Muslims on the planet are terrorists, which of course is an absurd position. How do you begin to change the perspectives of people? Well, Davis has, I think, a very effective approach. She talks about 20 years of interacting with Muslims, everyday people, and having conversations with them and experiencing and sharing hospitality with them. And she provides tips along the way for what she calls a listening apologetic, or sorry, a listening evangelism. So, where you listen to the other person and you understand and truly process what their perspectives are, and begin to cultivate a shared understanding. This is very much in keeping with what I have called an apologetic of agreement, which contrasts with what I've called an apologetic of agitation. I find that many evangelical and conservative Catholic apologists today, they focus on an apologetic of agitation. They argue with other people and try to maximize the difference and the contrast and the perceived contradictions between whatever it is they're debating, whether it's atheism or naturalism or Democrats or Islam. They want to maximize the difference and the contrast, which creates agitation rather than looking for what are the bridges of understanding between these different groups, as Davis does here. And I find that Davis captures Paul's approach in Acts 17 when he spoke at Mars Hill and he was speaking with the Stoics. What did he do? He built a bridge of understanding by saying, hey, I want to talk to you about this altar you have, the statue to an unknown God. And I want to affirm your understanding of this unknown God, because your own poets have said, in him we live and move and have our being. We are his offspring. So his truth is already in your community. And I want to just talk about that further. This is what the missiologist Don Richardson called so points of contact with other cultures. You find what those points of contact are, and then you build from them in an apologetic of agreement. And that captures very much what Davis is doing in this book. Listen to your to your Muslim neighbors, understand what their views are, and find the places where you can agree with them. And there are a lot of places where you can agree with them. To begin with, I mean, she points out that one of the wonderful things about living in a Muslim country is you can go up to almost anybody and immediately have a very vibrant and committed discussion about the nature of God. And she points out it's very difficult to have that in much of the secular West. But if you're living in a Muslim country, she repeatedly describes herself going up to Muslims and like often in that when she's riding in a taxi cab and saying, hey, do you love God? Tell me, what are your views of God? And the cab driver will launch into a very excited and passionate discussion about what their theological views are. And even right there is already an apologetic of agreement or a bridge of understanding. And you just go from there. She also talks that she gives this great example. It goes at page 100. So this is back in 2003 where she was talking with another lady and we were having a great conversation, she says, until she asked me, are there any prophecies in the Bible about Muhammad? No, I answered. Or why? She wanted to know. And then Davis says this, I responded, because Muhammad is not a prophet. With that statement, my teacher's countenance completely changed from excitement and delight to completely unreceptive. That statement shut down the conversation for an entire year. Was it necessary for me to make a negative statement about Muhammad? Some would say I was simply telling the truth, but was it necessary in the moment? We can probably all agree that some things, though they may be true, just do not need to be said. If I was eating dinner at someone's house and took a bite of something I experienced as disgusting, I would not cry out, "This is disgusting." That would be considered rude and disrespectful. So even though Davis doesn't believe Muhammad was a prophet, let alone the final prophet of God, in that moment, she, in retrospect, recognized it was harmful to her relationship with this other individual to share that. And this is an encouragement for Christians all to exercise wisdom as we are engaged in a listening apologetic with our Muslim neighbors, to understand what their views are, find the points of contact that we can agree with, and begin to build those bridges of understanding. And recognizing that we don't have to convert anybody, it's the Holy Spirit's job to bring us both into greater truth. Now, Davis is not an academic theologian, and so she doesn't use a lot of the terms that I might use. For example, I don't believe she used the term inclusivist, but I would certainly classify her as an inclusivist soteriologically, meaning that she has a view that the Holy Spirit is already working in Muslim community, drawing people to God, and that just as the Holy Spirit works in Christian communities, drawing people to God, so he works in Muslim communities. She does reference at one point the parable of the sheep and the goats. And I think that's a very opposite parable because in the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, you have some people that are surprised to be sheep because they never, I guess, thought of themselves as sheep. And they were counted sheep because of their love expressed for others. And then there are others who thought they were sheep, and yet it turns out they were goats because they not did not embody that love for others, marginalized people, people on the edges of society, right? And so on. And that is an interesting, I think, sobering teaching for all of us that the boundaries of soteriologically reconciled people to God is not the same thing, does not map reliably onto whatever our religious community may be. If you think just because you're a Christian that you're in the in group, well, Matthew 25, the words of Jesus have something pretty sobering to say about people who thought they were sheep, who in fact turned out to be goats. And likewise, if you assume that because people are Muslims that they're lost, well, maybe Jesus also has something to say to sober you up on that score because maybe the Holy Spirit is already working redemptively in those communities, and you look at the love of neighbor expressed by individuals in those communities to begin to track with where God is working and where his truth and kingdom is to be found. Now, there's an illustration of this that I've often given, and I'm going to apologize in advance for people who have heard me share this before, but I found it to be a pedagogically a very effective thought experiment to really drive this point home. So it was the year was 1994. It was Rwanda. In April of that year, what became the most efficient, quote unquote, genocide of the 20th century began to unfold as Hutus targeted the minority Tutsi population, slaughtering people in close contact killing using often agrarian instruments like sickles and scythes and machetes. By the end of the genocide, well, it didn't, I mean, it continued on sporadically, but it really sort of officially ended in July of 1994. And in those 3 months, more than 800,000 Tutsis had been slaughtered by Hutus. Now, Rwanda was the most Christian country in Europe at the time, Europe in Africa, ostensibly Christian. And what ended up happening then is there are many people who professed to be faithful Christians who carried out this genocidal slaughter of their neighbors. And one of them was a Seventh-day Adventist pastor named Elizaphan Tarama. He was Hutu. He was part of the majority group carrying out the genocide. And some of his own congregants were minority Tutsis that reached out to him secretly in hiding, begging for him to help save their lives. And instead, he sent the militias in to slaughter them. Uh, so that was Elizaphan Nikitarama. And the other person I talk about in this thought experiment is Mabai Diagne. He was part of the UN peacekeeping forces centered in Kigali in Rwanda. And day after day, he defied orders to remain within the encampment and instead took his Land Rover out and wearing his blue beret, uh, only had cigarettes, did not have a gun to fire, and he would bargain, he would find Tutsis hiding in the streets and get them into his Land Rover. And then he would cross Hutu checkpoints with very aggressive young men wielding machetes, wanting to kill the Tutsis in that Land Rover. And he would get them through the checkpoints, bargaining with cigarettes and telling jokes. And I tell you, it takes a pretty strong character to day after day, week after week, for 3 weeks he did this, saving dozens and dozens of Tutsi lives until he was killed in the genocide. Now, I say to people, if you could choose to have the life and legacy of the quote unquote Christian pastor who participated in genocide or the Muslim peacekeeper who saved the lives of people threatened in the genocide, which would you choose to have on Judgment Day, standing before God? The Christian who had the quote unquote right theology but did not love his neighbor, or the Muslim peacekeeper who had the wrong theology but did in fact love his neighbor? And I very rarely had anybody say they would choose to be the Christian pastor who participated in genocide. I've had some people refuse to answer, but I've honestly, actually, I don't think I've ever had maybe one or two people say what they would rather be the genocidaire who had quote unquote good theology. That's just a way of driving home some of the central points of Bridges of Love and Understanding. So that's, I guess, a review of the book. I would really strongly recommend you check this book out. I think it's a very valuable contribution in this age of racism, of xenophobia, of Islamophobia, and just of general toxicity. We need to have more people like Rebecca Davis who are saying we need to have meaningful, generous conversations with other people outside of our in group, people that often we've been taught to fear and to hate, people like our Muslim neighbors, and find out where the Spirit of God is working in their communities, and share the love that we have for our own God, our own understanding of God, and our faith with them as well. So check out the book. I've linked it below if you're interested in learning more.